Great. Well, welcome everyone to the first joint collaboration webinar between Controlled Events and S.T.O.R.M.4 Events, and joined today by Garry Jones from S.T.O.R.M.4 Events. And Garry, we met, it was quite a few years back at Coventry University Simulation Centre on the topic of security, terrorism and exercising and getting people ready for emergencies, and that's sparked our conversation and our collaboration. So welcome everyone today to a really topical session on preparing for the Protect duty. I'm Rob Walley from Controlled Events, and I really wanted to kick off our planning for this year on this topic with a joint session with Garry and S.T.O.R.M.4 Events. So I'm going to be interviewing Garry. He's the expert in this field, and after we scheduled this session, the Protect duty gained Royal Assent last week, so a really topical theme. We're going to be sharing resources during the session afterwards, and looking forward with some interest to what's coming up next in terms of the legislation, the guidance. We know others that we're working closely with. The UK Crowd Management Association have got a Q&A session later in the month that we'll signpost you to as well. So welcome, Garry.
Thanks for the invite. It's
pleasure.
Really good to be here. Thank you. It's very topical, as you say. Yeah.
Well, I mean, briefly, I've introduced myself. I've been involved in emergency planning. This has been one topic of many that I've been involved in, from a civil protection, from an event management perspective, and Controlled Events. We're all about trying to plan for and respond to events. But on this topic, I can't think of anyone better qualified to give some authentic advice. There's a lot of people out there, but potentially with knowledge on this topic, but I'll hand over to Garry for a bit of an intro on yourself and S.T.O.R.M.
Thanks, everyone. I've looked at the users, or the people who are on the line, and I know a lot of you, so a big welcome to those I know and those I don't. I'm Garry Jones, 30-year cop, retired in 2017. Latter part of my service, I was trained as a CT SECO, Counter-Terrorism Security Coordinator, which basically wraps protective security holistically around events and individuals. And probably for the last 13 years now, I've delivered the National CT SECO course for the College of Police, and I still do that. In fact, my counter-terrorism risk management team at S.T.O.R.M. are the only trainers that deliver the National College of Policing course. So that's what we are in relation to what we do in this business area. I set up S.T.O.R.M. when I left the job, and I recognised that actually individuals or the civilian world needed to understand protective security, much like the CT SECOs did. The College of Policing did not want to know in relation to training individuals, so I set about actually developing the Level 6 diploma course at the university. So we designed that and we deliver that at the university at the minute. And we're in the middle of moving university. So if anyone on the line is thinking, when is that university course coming? I can assure you it is coming. I'm just changing university, so hold fire with that.
Okay, fantastic. Well, warm welcome today. And the Terrorism Protection of Premises Act 2025 gained Royal Assent last week. We all saw the news. There's a Home Office fact sheet out there about it. But this session is all about unpacking and unpicking what we know so far. There'll be a lot more guidance to come. But I'm going to ask Garry a number of questions just to try and get the conversation going. There's a Q&A element at the end as well, so do pose points in the chat, pose questions. We want to start a dialogue on this. There'll be many out there talking about this topic. We're really keen to sort of kick that off today. So I'll kick off with first question. In the draft bill, there was a lots of talk about who's in scope, who isn't, what locations would fall within the sort of purview of this act. So from your perspective, Garry, with what we know at the moment, what locations are going to fall into scope of the act?
Yeah, if I may, before, caveat from me, and I think from Rob as well, the legislation is in place and there's policy documents in place, but there's lots of unknowns. So this is our interpretation thereof. No one can say this is definitely what's happening. If anyone tries to say that to you and sell it to you as such, then actually they're lying to you. This is our interpretation of the statute and the policy documents, and we're basing it based on experience. So back to your question, what's in scope in relation to premises? I think firstly you've got to think about the aim of the act. Keep that in mind in relation to what the aim of the act looks like. And if you have that thread of thought throughout when you're thinking, it's reducing the risk of physical harm. It's reducing the vulnerability to acts of terrorism. So reducing the risk, reducing vulnerability. Premises, it depends on the size. It's qualifying premises. That's what the term is. Qualifying premises, 200 people at the same time. So that's where you start the actual classification of premises themselves. And you've got to ask yourself is predominantly, do do predominantly people of 200 people use the premises at the same time. Yeah, so that classes you as a qualifying premises, but the usage of that premises has to fit within the schedule of the topics or the areas of business, and they're varied. Clearly, the entertainment industry, the music industry, that's easy. You've got shops, you've got leisure centres, sports grounds, libraries, museums. There's lots of educational establishments, football grounds, things like that. There's lots of things that will fall into qualifying premises. So once you've established your qualifying premises, that's 200 people at one time, and also fitting within the schedule itself, the usage. There are two layers within that as well. You've got what's called a standard duty premises, which are premises with 200 to 799, and then you've got enhanced duty premises, which are 800 and above. And that's important to remember: standard duty, enhanced duty, because that will lead on to what they need to do later on. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And during this, at some point in our discussion, I'm really interested in, sort of as a father and as a family member, had family caught up quite close to some of the attacks in London before, who falls outside the scope. Because for me, as a layperson, not as a security expert, there's a bit of who must do it and who should do it, and the court of public opinion, and will incidents that fall outside a venue outside the scope, we're all going to be judged on actually how effective were our arrangements anyway. So are there other acts? And
I think if you start looking pre-Martyn's Law, pre the legislation currently, there was an inferred requirement to protect the individuals at your site, protect your security, protect your staff, protect the attendees, either under the Health and Safety in Work Act or Common Law Negligence or Occupiers Liability Act. That was an inferred obligation. What we've now got for specific size events and sites is a mandated requirement to do certain things, and that's the change. It's from an inferred responsibility to an it's now definitely in statute what you've got to do. And the question is, if you fall outside the scope, premises under 200, do you need to do anything? Well, that's a conscience thing then, I think, for individual premises, because actually it's good business to do what we're doing, and certainly for the lower level standard duty, there's not expensive things to do. It's good management. And actually think about consequences. It might not be a CT consequence, but actually other consequences, be it theft, be it workplace violence, etc., or safeguarding. The things you put in place to protect your premises or your staff will enhance security and safeguarding as well. So under 200, do you have to do it by legal standards? No. However, think about the other consequences you are defending against. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. So locations in scope. I think the guidance document from the Home Office is a useful starting point there, and we'll come back to sort of who might fall sort of in some part in this. I'm interested also in years back. I was working in emergency planning in Brent, and I was always interested at Argus and Griffin sort of police presentations at the precinct of people, the publicly accessible locations. Actually, we might all have our own plan. Or what does it look like when our plan's together? Yeah,
I think if you start looking at shopping precincts and things, obviously there's going to be premises within there will feature within the 200 or standard duty, or actually the enhanced duty, but also it's a bigger venue with multiple venues within inside. So there's a cooperation requirement between the responsible people. We'll explain responsible people as we go along. Okay. So lots of cooperations involved when you've got multiple sites sitting together. One of the other things that fall out of it is that event space as well, the qualified event. So we've got a enhanced duty. You've got the standard duty, but then you've got enhanced events as well, the qualifying events. Now, events is different because effectively there is a caveat for events. You've got to be able to say they've got to be an access point. Access point, controlled access point from a ticket or monetary ticket, counting them in, counting them out. And once you've got that control and restriction on it, then straight away you're in scope. Yeah, especially if you're in the public space. So let's just use an example of a road race that goes through the city. It could be a carnival. Normally, if they've got no control of access, the public stand on the road, it's out of scope. It doesn't come into scope. So one could argue, actually, you've got some big gigs, certainly in London, that involve a free-flowing carnival or procession or movement across the road, vast numbers. But if there's no control of people entering certain zones within that, it is not within the scope of this Act. So one could argue, well, why not? Don't know. But what you can do is, if you have got a grandstand area along that route, for example, let's say classical thing, let's use London Marathon for example, you've got areas which are set aside for grandstand, start and finish and things like that, whereby people may have to pay. And that falls in that you have to pay to go through an access control, and as a result, if there's over the 800 people within that venue, that area space, you can come within scope. Yeah, so it's all about access and control on them bigger, wide events as well.
Okay. Thanks very much. Well, in terms of what we know so far, and that caveat you gave before, what do we know about the requirements so far in terms of what it's going to mean for us for different venues, different events?
Yeah. So we touched on two premises labels. We've got standard duty and the enhanced duty. So I'm going to go with the standard duty for a start and talk about what they need to play with. So if you start thinking of the responsibilities for standard duty, it's about those 4 procedures we need to work through. Yeah. Firstly, evacuation. Yeah. How do you evacuate individuals from the premises of the event itself? Yeah. What does that look like? How have you? It's all right if you've got one door, you've got multiple doors. Who's shutting the doors? Where's the threat coming from? So that's them sort of questions you're going to do. Now, if you're a small premises, that'd be quite easy to do, because all you've got to do is make sure that people know that if there's a threat outside, who's locking the door and how do you lock the door? It's no good saying I'm going to lock the door and the keys are in the back or hidden in someone's pocket or something. What is the process of locking that door? And we go on lots of premises where we're turning around and saying, okay, well, how do you physically lock the door? Who's going to do it? Well, where's the doors? Who's going to do the doors? How can you physically lock the door and what mechanism are you doing? That could even be a bar, a bolt. Yeah. So think now from a normal point of view. Again, think about consequences. We're talking about CT, but actually many of you at premises, there could be something outside, a drunk's outside, disorderly behaviour outside. It could be something that you don't want into your premises, as a matter of fact. How would you lock the door? It's that getting there, locking the door and evacuating people from the threat. Think to yourself from evacuation, where would you evacuate? If your threat is coming through the front door, how do you evacuate to the back door? Potentially. So you've got to evacuate away from threat, and that's the difference. So if you think of your fire evacuation, that's all the doors pop open, everyone pops out every single evacuation. What we're looking at now is actually thinking about where's the threat coming from and evacuating cleverly away from threat. And that goes back to your planning assumptions. What's your planning assumptions for attack? What does that look like? Is your planning assumption going to be your attack will come through that front door, or is it more inclined to go through the rear door? We don't know, do we? We don't know where that plan assumption is going to come from, but make an assumption, the attack's going to come through that front door. Right, I need to evacuate, potentially, to the back, potentially. Or if I've got a device or something inside my premises, how do I get people to evacuate? What is my process? You know, we've had evacuations from various venues, from cinemas to theatres to flower shows, all over the place. But actually, how do you move people out of harm's way? How do you communicate that? So that goes into, so evacuation is one of the procedures you need to get really sorted out in relation to the standard duty. Now, not just evacuation, invacuation as well. That basically means we're moving people from one place in the premises to another place in the premises. And now there's an inference as well that evacuation infers pulling people off the street outside your premises as well, which is a little bit different from interpretation. So it'd be interesting to see what that comes out with the clarity of some more guidance. Does evacuation mean dragging them off the street in front of your door to evacuate into a safer place or not? Wait to see. But the same sort of principle, if you're evacuating, how are you going to do that? What's the methodology you're doing it? So if you've only got one door, if you've got multiple doors, what's that look like? Who's doing the doors? What's the communication? What's the process look like? Yeah, and then it links into all of this lockdown. So if you've got a threat on the external, or you could have a threat on internal, but let's assume there's a threat on the outside of your premises, and it could be a person with a knife, it could be a person with a gun, anything like that. And indeed, it could be just that drunken person, you just want to lock the door and stop them coming in. How do you lock the door? What's your lockdown process? Don't rely on people thinking they're going to be able to do it. You've got to be able to say, okay, well, if we call lockdown, who does what? So how many doors are there at your premises? Do you know? Because that's what I'll be looking at. If I'm thinking like as I call it, my bad dude, my terrorist cell, I'm thinking, actually, the way I could attack this premises might be 6 or 7 doors. that's what you've got to think. How could they get into my premises? Then you're going to make an assumption. Okay, logically, they're probably going to come through that front door. Okay. So if you can't lock them all, let's lock that front door. And how do you get that door locked? Who's going to do it? Who, literally. How are you going to communicate them to do it? And are you physically going to lock the door? Is that going to be keys? Is it automated? Is it locked? Is it a bar? Is there little bits of wire? Don't matter. 10 seconds will slow someone down. And we've seen that on numerous attacks where the terrorists have approached doors, they've seen a blocked door, and they've realised, I'm not going to waste energy going through the door. I've got to maximise my kill, and I'm going to move on. And they'll move on to a more insecure premises. So locking that door. So that lockdown procedures, that's 3 procedures we talked about. Evacuation, evacuation, and lockdown. And the procedure, or the process, the last one, really covers them all, I think. It's that communication piece. And we've talked about that communication. How do you communicate? Firstly, security-wise, how do you communicate the process I've just talked about? How do you communicate, okay, we're doing evacuation? How do you communicate where the threat is? What's that communication role for your security? Not just your security, because actually you want to make sure your concessions people are going to be aware of the threat as well. So how do you communicate with the staff on your premises? But importantly as well, how do you communicate with the people, your audience, your clients? How do you communicate? What do you communicate? When do you communicate? Who communicates? So there's a big piece on that in relation to who manages that. And you've got to have a thought process before it happens. Because if you try and deliver this dynamically without a plan, you will fail. There's no two ways about it. Because if you think of, we're talking about really, really bad scenarios happening. And when bad scenarios like this happen, people are getting really, really stressed. And they're not going to be thinking straight.
Yeah,
anything, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
anything you can do to give them some form of crutch or action card or anything like that. And I know you've got some cracking ones with what you put on your control rooms. Any action card you've got, which will assist people in that sort of really high stress point from a process point of view, which supports your process, is ideal because it speeds up that thought process because your brain's all muddled. Okay, we'll go. Okay, lock the door. And it sounds easy. It sounds common sense, but actually sometimes common sense goes out the window in that stressed environment. So it's best to have an action card of some sort.
Okay. And
that was born out from the Manchester Inn Inquiry. Action cards was a big driver that came out from that. Let's get action cards and get that fluidity of action, that dynamic response all the time. Yeah.
And in pulling together some of the info for this session today, later on in the session we'll talk about resources. What I'm reassured to see is that there's actually quite a wide array of free and easy to access resources that are going to help a lot of organisations along the way with this. So we'll come back to that maybe a little bit later. So from a enforcement point of view, hopefully a lot of people are going to want to do this. I bet a lot of venues and events, and actually a lot of other clients of ours are on the line today, then they don't actually fall within the act, but they want to do the right thing. They might be caught up in someone else's attack. They want to sort of have arrangements in place. So who's going to fall inside this kind of enforcement? What's enforcement going to look like with what we know so far?
Well, okay, the regulator's going to be the SIA. The SIA's got to kick in a lot of times, but I mean, actually they've got a big ask now to develop the packages, the guidance, etc. So as I mentioned, the caveat initially, there's a lot of guidance and statutory clear guidance and SIA guidance and templates to be developed. So going forward from here on in, we've got to be looking at 2 years, I would have thought, before anything really gets to the point where they can start enforcing anything, because they've got to give us the templates, they've got to give us the structure, they've got to give us the guidance, the detail within the Act, because the Act says some things, but there's so many gaps that need to be filled, and that's where they'll come in. So let's say 2 years hence, the legislation will have its full teeth. The question is, what do we do in the meantime? I think we're going to have good, clear steers as to what that looks like, and we can start putting in processes, like we've just talked about, the evacuation, lockdown, that communication piece, just the standard. Clearly, I've not talked about the actual enhanced duties, we'll talk about in a minute, but you've got to be thinking about that's what we can do at this point. And from this point on to 24 months later on, I think it's more about education. I think even when they actually get all the regulations in place, it'll be more education and support. Unless you're a prolific offender, for want of a better word, I think the actual full enforcement won't happen. It's education. And actually, it tries to level the playing field, because there's a lot of premises, a lot of events and venues that do this stuff. And that costs money in some respects. Actually, there's other venues that don't. And what we're trying to do now is make everyone do the same sort of stuff. And this is that supportive nature, I think, what will happen.
I'll raise the bar and sort of get some consistency.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So from a point of view of understanding the threat, I'm really interested from the courses that I've observed you delivering. So what's the threat looking like at the moment? We hear from authorities about what the threat level is like, what specific. I've got an event coming up this weekend, really good engagement with the security coordinator and good liaison in place. But how do we try and translate understanding what the threat is in terms of then applying sort of how we're going to manage risk?
Sure. I think the big question is, how do you convert that threat to what the risk is to your event? So if you applied the national threat level as substantial, then effectively, does that mean my event is going to be subject to attack? Actually, we've got to look at your event and its attractiveness, what we call a target attractiveness. Think to yourself now, and this is how I have to think. I am going to be a terrorist. I want to maximise my kill. Actually, I want to make sure the event is worthwhile me going to, or this site is worth going to. Is it attractive to me? Now, there's various ways of thinking through this process. You've got to move from the national threat picture. And I always say it on courses, think about the national threat picture as like a weather forecast. It's like lightning. The weather forecaster will turn around and say, within the UK somewhere today, there'll be lightning. Okay, does that mean everyone goes out with an umbrella and thinking I'm going to be struck by lightning? No, it doesn't. What you want to do as an event or a site is think, actually, what's the likelihood of the lightning hitting my venue and my gig? And that's where you start looking at some risk management processes that we've got, whereby you start thinking, okay, how iconic would this venue be? The kudos it would give the attacker if they're successful delivering an attack at this site, at this venue. How iconic it is. Is it stabbing the art of sort of Britain PLC sort of thing? Mm-hmm. Or is it a backwater place which really no one's really going to care about? That's, with the greatest respect, there's going to be classes. Not every event is the same. Mm-hmm. So we can't be the same across the piece. So we've got to think about the attractiveness, how iconic it is. Do I, as a terrorist, want to kill myself with no media? The idea of terrorism is to spread terror. So if I'm doing it down a dark alley somewhere with no media, well, actually, it's a bit of a really poor terrorist attack, isn't it? So we've got to think about, what's your media presence look like on your gig or your site? Yeah, if you've got sort of live news, it's really national, international news, it's dynamic news. Actually, if I do an attack now, then actually I've got a good chance of getting terror straight into the living rooms of Joe Public. Mm-hmm. So that's, is your iconic? Is there media involved in it? How predictable is your event or the running of security of your site? And what I mean by that is, think now, I'm thinking as a terrorist, think as a bad dude or dudette, that's my phrase. Think of the terrorist, they're going to have to get information about your site, your event. If I can potentially put a bomb or device at a fixed location at a fixed time, and I can find them fixed times and fixed locations out from research predictability, then that enhances I'm thinking that's attractive to me. Yeah. Think about your audience. The people who are coming through the door, they're sitting in the seats or standing up watching your gig or walking around your site. Are they more attractive to me as a terrorist? And that depends on which terrorist you're thinking about, what group of attackers you're thinking about, because certain attackers will have certain ideologies which go against certain groups. Yeah. So certain groups will attract a greater attractiveness. Yeah? Think about the actual talent or the artist that's on stage, or who's on stage delivering this performance. Have they got a reputation? Are they subject to conflict? Or have they done something controversial in the past? Which again flies in the face of the ideology. And if you start thinking of the density of the crowd as well, am I going to kill myself or try and kill when there's only one or two in the road? Or am I going to try and get a mass group of people? So your density is an issue as well. So there's lots of ways to start thinking of how attractive your venue and site is. And it's getting a process to write that down and audit that. So as soon as you've got that, you can then generate that into actually a risk rating, a RAG. Now, the question I always get asked is actually, Gary, you're okay? Because I'm still being fed lots of information because I still work on behalf of the College of Policing. for the second course. So we see quite a bit. So how do individuals on the call get that sort of information? Because what we're thinking now is attack methodology, what are the best attack methods people do, and also the target attractiveness, what they're attracted to. Well, if you have a read of, there's a few things, I'll say Paul Ree, if anyone's heard of them, they do some cracking quarterly, I think it's monthly reviews now actually, and it's a really quick and easy review. It tells you about latest attacks, it tells you about latest arrests. It's a really, really good concise read for the easy reader. I do Terroriscope personally. I find that's useful for us. There's a massive amount on Protect UK. Some would say too much because it's so vast, and that is the big problem with anything online. There is so much information out there. Where do you look? And clearly, you've got the MPSA website. Again, there's lots on there. Now, for those that are into the AI, and I've started playing with this now, you can start writing questions and prompts in AI to troll the internet, to drag this stuff back. So instead of you clicking on the websites I've just mentioned, if you write the question or prompt, as it's called in AI terminology, you will be able to get a very succinct delivery of information every day. And that's what I get every morning, which sounds really sad. I'm sitting having a cup of coffee at 9 o'clock. ChatGPT sends me a little letter which tells me all the death and destruction in the world. Terrorist attacks, vehicle-based attacks, any acid attacks, anything from MPSA or Protect UK. That automatically comes to me. I don't have to hunt for it. It comes to me.
Yep.
You've got to. So I advocate get yourself switched on to AI as to that sort of thing it can do, because it saves you so much time trawling the internet.
Organised pessimism.
Well, yeah. It's you've got to understand the land, the lay of the land, to be able to protect. So unless you know what the threat actors want to do to you, how can you protect what's happening?
Yeah, and maybe later on when we're talking about resources and contacts, I mean, I think it's going to be a lot of partnership working with the appropriate authorities to get those insights on a venue, an event sort of specific basis. But I mean, looking at in a bit more detail, vulnerability. How do we assess the vulnerability of a venue? I mean, you've been doing this with a lot of different organisations for a long time. Already, what are the kind of tools and resources, techniques, or how do you assess vulnerability?
Well, the first thing I'll go back and say, well, vulnerable to what? And that's learning about the attack methodologies. What's the likely attack methodology at the minute? And if you start thinking it's low-level attack, self-initiated terrorist, it's a blunt-bladed force weapon, so it's a knife or a small pistol or something like that, IED, or vehicle as a weapon. They're the sort of top ones that we start thinking about. But what are we vulnerable against? And as soon as you start thinking about, okay, am I vulnerable? And the only way I do it is I'll go onto a site, go to an event, and I'll actually look at an event. You've got to get in the head of what the terrorist wants to do. It's quite a dark thought process, but you've got to think to yourself, right, if I was going to use a vehicle as a weapon at this event, where could I do it and how could I do it? Because that starts thinking that's the vulnerability, because that triggers the gap. So as long as you know what's missing, how can I stab people at your site with a knife? Well, have you got a search regime? Well, there's a vulnerability if you've not. What's the search regime look like? Well, it's any unpredictable bag search. Okay, well, fine, I'll just shove the knife down the small of my bag. So think about what is stopping me as a terrorist doing that attack becomes a vulnerability. The big challenge for people is understanding what works and doesn't work. And that bleeds into a bit of mitigation, but it's understanding if you've got something in place, do you really think it stops things happening? So you might have a process, but actually if you tested it, and this goes back to later on when you're training, exercising, you can have the best plan in the world. You can have, or you may think you've got the best plan in the world written down. It could be on gold leaf parchment for all I care, because if you've not ran it through a test and exercise, it ain't worth the paper it's written on. Because I can guarantee you can come to any venue, and a lot of people say, yeah, it works. I can guarantee you can lift up such stones and find out the key individuals that need to know what to do, where to go and when to do it, are not in the loop, are not been told about the plan, or don't recognise the communication things. So it's finding what that looks like.
Okay.
Yeah.
So from a point of view of risk mitigation. I mean, I think some people's first thought when you think protect duty is this is going to be a huge burden. There's lots of training that I'm going to need, physical measures. Like you mentioned, different levels of impact that the act's going to have on different organisations based on size and other factors. So what does risk mitigation look like? What are the tools and techniques out there that can be brought to bear by any organisation trying to wrestle with this?
I think the key here is, again, we've got to look back to the plan assumptions. What are you planning to defend against? Because your mitigation is going to drive what you're planning to defend against. So have you thought about that? So if you start thinking about a terrorist attack, are you thinking of an attack involving one group of 2 individuals armed with a knife? Or are you thinking of multi-groups, Mumbai style, multi-groups armed with knives? And what's the most prevalent? Actually, just get your plan assumption right and then start thinking what you're going to mitigate against. So the big problem here is if you only have an hammer, you'll treat everything like a nail. Yeah, and I see an awful lot of, I've gone to lots of premises, lots of venues, lots of sites where I've started asking questions to security managers. Say, well, what you got that there for? Well, someone sold it them. Well, why do you do that? I didn't know that. Because the people that sold it to them were the people doing the assessment. So, would you buy something? Would you get someone to assess something and tell you how many you needed if you're going to buy it? That's that question of sort of, there's some really good legitimate people out there that will advise appropriately and deliver appropriately. However, there's sort of snake oil charmers that will scare the EBGBs out of people, and as a result of which you end up having bollards all over the place, or too much security, which is not proportionate. So, and that's the big thing. I think also what you've got to think about is consequences. And also do not reinvent the wheel. If you've got an event or you've got a site, I've no doubt you've got a level of search, or you've got a perimeter, or you might have CCTV. They may be for other things, stop the drugs coming in, stop the alcohol coming in. Yeah. So we're doing stuff already. So all we need to do is probably re-engineer some of the reason why we're doing stuff and making that relevant in the brief. So instead of the brief being, search and privacy articles including alcohol and whatever, beers and knives and whatever, make sure that it includes all that other stuff which is CT based, because that's your rationale. Yeah, and clearly I rationalise based on terrorists, to try and stop them, to detect them, to deter them. But actually the biggest and strongest rationale I can do is use a rationale which is business sense for a business, i.e. actually you need a secure perimeter because it supports your safeguarding requirement. Because that's a strong argument now. If I go to a venue and find out there's a big hole in their security perimeter, yes, I want that security perimeter fixing because it's a CT risk. It's not going to deter anyone coming through. But actually, more importantly, probably to the client, or terrorists is important, but actually the bigger risk potentially for them is safeguarding. So we'll use that, and whatever business area that's got, think about your business area. You're already putting protection around certain elements of it. Use that protection you've got and re-engineer what you've got. Think about mitigation as 3 things. It's about processes, it's about people, and it's about equipment. So, and the classic breakdown for this would be, okay, think of a search. You want to put a search in place. What do you need? Well, for a start, what is the process of the search? The physical process. What do you expect of the search to happen? Now, don't use wide words on this. I want to talk about words that can be interpreted, because effectively whatever's in your plan, someone's going to interpret what's in your plan. So make sure you know what you want to have in your search, what level of search that looks like. So that is the process, what's written down, what's coming in, what's not coming in. Okay. You need the people, i.e. the security on the doors, who's on the doors doing the search, following the process. Yeah. Are they trained? Are they competent? Are they supervised? So all them things kick in. And then part of that process, well, what sort of kit they're going to have? Is it handheld metal detectors? It's walk through, whatever. What does that look like? So the integration of them, that person, that people, that equipment becomes that systematic layering of security, My favourite thing about onions is layers. I'm not mentioning onions.
No, we've got this far through without. We'll have to hear a bit more about onions later on. Well, I mean, I think some people might be daunted by, but as you say, the snake oil salespeople trying to push particular solutions, whatever they might be, plans, training, exercising, any services. But as also the people trying to wrestle with, well, what is proportionate? So when people use that proportionate phrase, it's a difficult question to address now. But with what we know so far, when people talk to you now, pre-Protect ET being in previous projects, what does proportionate look like? How do we try and assess that?
We'll start from, there's various aspects of this. Proportionality is risk appetite, risk tolerance driven. It's risk appetite from you as the individual assessor, because I've got a risk appetite, you've got a risk appetite, and I don't know how many you've got on the actual webinar, but each of you have got risk appetites, which may be different, or guaranteed there will be a spread of risk appetite, what we think is acceptable risk and what is unacceptable risk. What we're looking at is that moderate middle ground that we want to try and be in that risk management area. So what do we tolerate, what we allow to continue to happen, and what we won't tolerate? So that's us as individuals as part of that security or safety overlay. But equally, the bosses, the big client, the person that's going to sign off any sort of recommendation, sign off the money to do the recommendation, they will have a risk appetite as well. So there's got to understand what your client's appetite looks like for risk without actually compromising your own risk appetite. And then it's actually putting something in place that fits that risk. You've got to get all that risk element for a start. What's the vulnerability look like? So you've got the risk. What's the vulnerability look like? Okay, we've got that vulnerability. Are you happy with it, or do you need to take the vulnerability or the risk down? And if you take the risk down, you put more mitigation in place. The level of mitigation is going to be subject to that risk appetite and that tolerance of risk. And if you start thinking of a cost-benefit analysis, for example, you start thinking of, if it is a big risk of something happening with little cost, woe betide you don't do that little cost mitigation, because actually if something did happen and you didn't put a little cost mitigation in place for a big risk, you'll be criticised. If you've got a big cost against a little risk, one can actually rationalise, I'm going to tolerate that. It's all about balance as well. So what you sometimes see is the lack of scalable mitigation. And what I mean by that is, if you start, let's just think about hostile vehicle mitigation. There's tons of people flogging it now. Everyone seems to be flogging it. So if you start thinking of, I want to stop a car on a road, I want to deter vehicles on a road, I can go to gold standard stuff. I can go to the PAS 68, it's all Highway 14, bollards and barriers and everything that you see on the roads. Yeah, okay, great. They'll do the stuff subject to how they're laid out and things. There's an awful lot I can do before I get to that stage in that cost, which is more efficient and easier for me to do. It just needs a little bit of creativity and a little bit of rationalisation based on risk. So if you start going from I can do nothing, I've got to rationalise why I don't do nothing. But actually, does a cone stop it? Well, it might deter. It's not going to do an awful lot, is it? But actually, what else can you do? Okay, I don't know, ton bag of sand on the road. Is a terrorist going to ram his car into a ton bag of sand? Could they get through it? Yes, they could. Is it going to stop them? It's going to deter them, isn't it? You're not going to hit it. If you want to try and kill people, you're going to hit a ton bag of sand. Any obstacle on the road. So you can start thinking about what you're putting on the road to slow vehicles, delay the vehicles, deterring the vehicles. You've got to get in the head of the terrorists to slow them down, deter them away from your gig. If they see in the open space, they're going to do it. Yeah. But you don't have to automatically jump from, I ain't doing anything, right, let's put bollards in place. That's disproportionate for everything. There's a place and time for bollards for sure, but actually there's an awful lot of other times when actually bollards are not the answer. When I say bollards, I'm talking about the high-rated bollards. Yeah, there's lots of things we can do in the place.
So it's going to be a bit of a jigsaw of different arrangements that help us prepare. Interested in this stage of the talk on resources and what's available out there, and from a point of view of on screen, just putting up a few of the ones that we're collectively aware of. I mean, Home Office guidance is going to be designed to be easy to follow. Their wording kind of doesn't need particular expertise. Doesn't require third-party products or services, so I think it's really clear from the outset that there's not going to be some dependency on the private sector to help.
No, I think there's, as you say, there's some really good quality, well thought out and delivered posters, campaigns, videos, aid cards, on the ones you've just shown on the screen. It's basically MPSA, it's Protect UK, Action Aid. There's Citizen Aid. There's loads of good quality sheets, action sheets. So why would we reinvent the wheel? So, and when we are delivering, why would I try and create thoughts when actually people, very, very clever people at MPSA, have actually worked out what works. So let's use what works. It just makes sense, and there's an awful lot, and I think that sort of portfolio of guidance and documents will only grow and grow and grow. And if you start thinking, concentrating on more than terrorist attack, the amount of study and research that's gone on to either control room activity in relation to our control room's behaviour, and you know this as well as I do, there's phenomenal amount of work that's going on for that in relation to movement of people, how the people do it, and as a result of which, what tunnels and what messaging goes out. There's advice out there. Use the advice. The problem is there's so much advice, and that's probably where people come to us to say, well, which bit of the advice do we pick in? It makes it smoother. But this can be done on your own. But there's a lot of things you've got to juggle in and bring in. Yeah.
And for me, every event, every venue I go to, I'm working out for myself. Does it pass the family test? Will I bring my young children to this venue? Do I feel safe? Do I see? I think your secos often call it sort of a presence of the abnormal. And kind of looking at what's in place at that venue. The people we pay the least are the people we expect the most of. It's those staff at the outer skin of an event who, for me, training them and making sure they're equipped is as important, if not more, than those who are in the boardroom and usually at these tabletops and usually attending training and that kind of thing.
Yeah, certainly we'll go to venues and premises whereby the upper management may have a false sense of belief, because they might have plans that looks all right, but actually put under stress, under a training scenario or real life scenario for that matter, and things fall down quite quickly. And if you start looking at every post-incident inquiry, a lot of it's to do with communication. A lot of it is how does that communication from the top down happen and the bottom up? What's that clarity command look like? There's all that thing that it may look good in writing, but actually do people know? If it's just a plan, it ain't no good as far as I'm concerned. You've got to plan and exercise and train it, because a plan is just a plan. It's a dusty bit of paper. It's making it physically take hold so people understand what their role is.
Yeah, it's interesting. Go back to what you said at the start around basics of what we need to have in place, and not just terrorism related, so evacuation and other topics. This kind of the resources for this he puts up on screen as references there. Protect UK. Action Counters Terrorism, a range of packages there. The National Protective Security Authority, MPSA. I mean, for me, some of the best training I've attended in a long time has been driven by really immersive, really focused training. But actually, the skill set isn't just helping you then with terrorism. It's good muscle memory for how we try and respond to other incidents as well. Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Programme, a lot of great resources out there for when we're working with partner agencies as well. And obviously we're waiting to see what the SIA, we're not going to say any more for now because we don't know what endorsement, what standards, what other resources might be coming down the track. But on screen are just a few of the references. Some of those posters, they're all openly accessible. I'm reassured that most venues and events I go to now, these things are wallpaper in the room in a good way mostly, but it goes back to the point around those that have been trained know what to look for, but does everyone know what their part to play is? And going back to your question around who's locking down, who's evacuating, how do we do this in a very time critical way?
I think it's critical for me is think consequences. One could argue terrorism, it doesn't happen very often, thankfully, but it's in our utmost mind now because obviously the protect duties come in. But the risk of dying from terrorism are very small. There's greater risks in the event world and all the world we live in than being killed by terrorists. But because of the psyche around terrorists and actually the way it is at the minute with the media, it's a greater risk perception. Now, but if you think about what is a consequence of a terrorist attack, actually it could be if it's an elderly person that's crashed the car into the queue at the front of your premises, your response will be very similar to a level if it was a vehicle as a weapon attack. If there was a wind structure collapse which would require an evacuation or an evacuation, it's the same as if you've got some form of threat, be it bomb or otherwise. Yeah. If you've got a person that's drunk outside or a violent person outside, not necessarily terrorist, it's the same as a lockdown procedure. So all we're doing is think consequences, and that's your buy-in, because sometimes people think, oh, it's CT. Well, actually, yes, it's CT, but it so supports a lot of other areas of business. And that's the strength of when you need to try and rationalise what you're doing, taking up to board level or management level to get the funding to do the mitigation. Because I know probably everyone on this call will want a safer event or space to work in for them and their customers. But actually the effects with challenges in relation to get the finance to do X, Y and Z. Some of what we're doing is free, but still time commitment to get that process sorted and done. But actually, if you've got to rationalise and discuss and argue that funding stream or that time to do X, Y and Z, then use a wider rationale than just CT.
Yeah.
Because that gets it over the line.
And it's a very similar concept to sort of when I've seen business continuity and resilience applied really well to organisations. Yes, there's a time and a place for risk-specific actions, processes, plans, procedures, but a lot of your planning needs to be consequence, not cause, because you've got to, at the end of the day, your response arrangements have got to stand the test of time and probably be implemented for a range of different scenarios.
There'll be nuances of change because of the way the CT threat picture is, but there's an awful lot of common themes that you can actually bring out from what you've existingly got. Definitely. So don't reinvent the wheel.
Well, I mean, I'm interested in having seen a few of your projects to sort of understand S.T.O.R.M.'s approach. You've mentioned vulnerability assessments, risk mitigation. Anything more you want to say in terms of sort of S.T.O.R.M.'s approach and how, I mean, you and I are not here at any point to sell anything. We're more, I think, from my perspective, thinking about how do we apply what we already do to support clients and venues and events who are wrestling with the same challenge.
I think our approach would be the approach I think people should do. And that's not just, what I'm saying, it's not paying us to do that, it's actually a process. Firstly, you need to understand the risk of your premises or your site and your event, the risk to you or your site, and what is that risk, where's that risk coming from. So you've got to think of threat to risk. What's your methodology? So you've got to do that risk assessment for a start to say, how risky is it? How target attractive this venue site is? How vulnerable you are? And then once you've got vulnerability and target attractiveness and threat all built together and the impact, you can then say, right, at my current state as I am at the minute security, this is the risk I've got before I do anything else. So that's the actual initial vulnerability assessment. Thereafter, you've got to make a choice. Are you going to tolerate the risk that's there? Or are you going to turn around and say, no, I need to put more mitigation in place or greater mitigation in place? And at that point, that may mean rationalising, getting costings, etc., or more time to do it, or more processes. But then actually deciding what you're going to do to take the risk lower, which will be basically that mitigation assessment. So combined, we call that, we've got these two sections, but effectively it's a counter-terrorism risk management process, the full risk assessment. Now, what I will point out here is if you've got a fixed site, and you do this for a fixed site, and we'll just say it's a music site venue, and you do it, you get it and do it once, and you recognise that's it. That will not suffice, because effectively any artist you bring in, remember that impact I talked about, that target attractions I talked about, every artist you bring in or every audience brings in may change the risk profile, the target attractiveness. And I'm going to use an example here, and it's my favourite example because it shows my age. Let's just say you've got a music festival site, which does various music festivals, but also does book signings and things like that. And on the Friday night, you've got Westlife playing. Oh, so Westlife is still around, isn't it? But anyway, Westlife are playing. And that will have a certain risk profile with the audience and the talent or the artist on stage. So, okay, your baseline is basically what that site says it is. But does that artist change that baseline? It probably doesn't. Let's use another example. On the Saturday night, Salman Rushdie is doing a book signing in front of American or Jewish audience. Now, if you recognise what I'm saying there, Salman Rushdie's got a fatwa to kill him. So straight away there's a greater target attractiveness for me as a terrorist to attack your site. And also there's openly discussion and dialogue that actually Americans or military or police or Jewish or anything like that is more attractive for me to kill as a terrorist. So if you're all of a sudden collating all of that, you're the same venue. If you're using that initial baseline risk assessment to say, yeah, it's all right, I've took you from Westlife on Friday night to really, really risky business on Saturday night. And if you've not calculated that change in shift in risk, that's a big issue for you. Yeah. So we go through risk assessment processes and think about that process of change for event by event by event. Clearly, there's procedures and plans to deliver. So some people we go to and we think, let's have a look at your CT plan. What does that look like? What's your processes look like? And some people have not got them. Clearly not got them. So we can you write them down. We do the time that people can't afford to do the time. Yeah. And then the question then is, okay, do we drop in quality assure what people do, because it's an uncomfortable time. It's an uncomfortable area of business sometimes in this CT. It seems to be like a dark art. It's not a dark art, it's a systematic process. But actually, you've got to have your finger on the pulse in relation to attack types and things. So there's a reassurance, a reputational protection reassurance that clients sometimes like to say, well, quality assure it. And then clearly then, your big thing, I've talked about it all along, you might have a CT plan, but if you ain't tested and trained it, or trained it and tested it, it ain't a plan. Yeah. And that's, I think that's where we're going to go, is basically, what's our testing, what's our training regime look like, and how do we work together to actually create a better training environment or exercise environment, which will really sort of uphold them stones in a nice way to be able to make it better. Yeah.
And for afterwards, we'll be sharing the resources with everyone, but some of the things that you've covered today, Garry, in terms of evacuation, lockdown, communications, some of the measures shown on screen here, and monitoring, controlling, safety and security. You're breaking what can be, like many topics, people can make it a dark art, but you're making it accessible to people, which I think is really reassuring. Training and exercising is mentioned quite a lot, something dear to my heart. I mean, out there at the moment, Action Counters Terrorism, individual training. I've got an event coming up this week, and we've all been mandated to sort of make sure we're up to speed. These things are updated, so there are resources out there now. Act in a box, very much like the National Cybersecurity Centre exercises in a box. There's a lot of resources out there that you could use with your management team, low to no cost, maybe even use it with partners and neighbours as well. See, check and notify, act strategic, and obviously there are bespoke trainers, providers and other resources out there, but there's a lot we can already be doing, because I think if I was sat there looking at the Act and I was potentially falling within it, I'm thinking, well, can I wait for guidance to come? What can I do now? And there's actually a lot out there already.
I think, again, defensive protection or protective security protection is all about layering of security. And that's when the onions come in. Onions got lots of layers, and the idea is to create multiple layers whereby the attacker will be deterred or detected or delayed, or will improve that response or assist the mitigation. So think about layering, but there's loads of little layers which you don't necessarily think are layers. So have you got good command and control? Have you got a good control room? Have you got good sort of procedures? We talk about lockdown plans, evacuation plans. Have you got the Act training, other people trained in Act? So very, very low level, cost-effective procedures, and probably 10 or 11 before you start really going into the very nuanced ones about the specific attack type and what sort of bollards we're going to have or what sort of search. Lots of procedural stuff which actually is really low cost and really efficient. Multiple layers. I'd sooner have loads and loads of multiple layers than one big bit of kit, because if I'm a terrorist, what have I got to do? I've got to compromise one big juicy bigger kit and I'm in through your door. However, if there's multiple layers, I've got to go through multiple layers of, and the idea for training is to switch people on. Yeah. Because, and we'll go back to the fact that you mentioned earlier, the lowest denominator is the individual that's standing at your door, or at that point in the back, or not on the search lanes. If they're not engaged and not with it and got the buy-in, then you're going to lose them, and that's your weakest point. If I go and I wreck it, or if I go and check something, I'm not going to go where the management tell me to go. I'm going to go where I think the weakest point is. and the weakest point will be where the supervisor not being. So again, it's looking about what that security overlay looks like, what the supervision overlay looks like, what that direction looks like. And again, from a fixed site, if you're a fixed venue, you've got your event safety plan, you might have a command and control in there. Because of the resilience issues with security providers now, there's sometimes multiple security providers at one fixed site. Have you actually pulled out their security plan to compare and contrast? Because that's what we do, and we find a massive disjoint sometimes whereby command and control is not the same. It all should be in tune with the event safety plan that's there at that site. But actually you might find that the command and controls are different. Your code words are different. And if that's not pulled apart either from looking at it or driving it through an exercise, when the day comes and something goes wrong at your venue, then actually you're going to have a real painful problem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, got a couple of minutes now at the end of this session for Q&A, so I'm going to pull up the chat and really welcome any sort of Q&A points people have. We see a few that have come up already. We won't mention anyone by name, but we'll raise a few. And as I say, there's UK Crowd Management Association Q&A later in the month, other resources that we will signpost and share with clients, contacts, you as attendees today. First question, I've seen a lot of reference to submitting documentation to the SIA. Haven't been able to find out how we do this. Would a free-to-attend non-ticketed outdoor festival fall within scope, assuming it would, as there's large groups there?
Right, so going back to that, so let's just say you've got a park whereby you're just basically say unticketed.
Yeah, so a free-to-attend non-ticketed outdoor music festival.
So it's unticketed, you've got no access control coming through the perimeter. So you've got no perimeter, you've got no access control. It's not ticketed, it's out of scope, isn't it? Yeah.
And we're very clear that it's too early to say what reference, what submitting documentation, what the arrangement will look like, but there will be a regime with the SIA for who needs to submit what, how that's going to be done.
Yeah, there's within the Act itself, it says basically the notification process and the forms required will be subject to statutory instrument and also guidance later on. So the nuances of when to do it, how to do it, and what forms to do it will come, and this is that transition part we're going to be doing. Some of that will be done by government, some of that will be done by the SIA.
Yeah. Okay. A few more coming in. How do we do a good test without causing alarm to others? I might take that one. I think there's a range of different ways you can test and exercise your plan, and given the sensitivity of the topic and having done a number of command and control exercises, live exercises, you've got to do these things incrementally. There's no point trying to test all aspects of your plan from all command levels all at the same time until you've got the building blocks right. Doing a test without causing alarm to your staff and your customers is all about, for me, building reassurance that this is sensible, common sense arrangements we should have in place for a range of scenarios. So I don't normally, when I'm working with people like S.T.O.R.M., start with, we're doing a terrorism exercise. We're doing an incident exercise where there might be a cause, but actually we're trying to deal with the consequence of actually how we manage a response to it. So we want to try and avoid that alarm. The whole idea is that we're trying to build capability, not alarm our public, our staff, and actually unbuild the confidence they might have.
I think one of the ways to do that is you've got a group of people and therefore the CT delivery, but as you say, it's consequence. And if you just did a straw poll within that room and said, well, how many have had people things stolen from the premises? So theft, how many have been concerned about someone outside that might be a drunk or something outside? What about safe? So if you bring it into their word and their life, and it gives them what's in it for me, you get the buy-in for them. Don't drive the terrorism, because that can be looking at quite dark and dangerous for people, and back away from it. Bring it to consequences.
Okay, a few more are coming in. So, template, is there a template now, or will there be, that would support trigger questions for us as security at venues to ensure we don't forget parts of a process? Well, I'll let you pick up the next one. I'll give you a break. I think there's a lot of resources already out there. I think there'll be more to come, but certainly a lot of resources already out there around how do we ask the right questions, how do we assess. There's a range of ACT, NACSO, MPSA resources, and any other thoughts in terms of
I think
what
there is an awful lot, and I think the problem is there is an awful lot, and it's lost in the smoke sometimes. Is there a definitive sort of checklist to say what do I need to do, how do I need to do it? No, nothing definitive. There's lots of bits. Is there something coming out? Don't know. There may be, because what you got to think of, you've got to take people down to understanding what vulnerability looks like, and to get them to do that, they've got to have a process of thought, and the way to do that would be a checklist of some sort.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly we'd do a checklist in our heads as to what we're going to do.
And I think as some of the questions you're asking are ones that we're going to have opportunities to consult with the SIA, some of the professional bodies that we're members of, UK Crowd Management Association and others, are good opportunities to feed back to the SIA the questions we have, for them to give us some of that clarity as well. Some meaty questions coming in way beyond the 2 minutes we're over here. So who's responsible for Zone X last mile?
What is Zone X last mile?
Yeah.
So one thing I will pick up on that, there's a term called immediate vicinity, which was is pushed into the Act as well. Now, on the initial guidance documents that came in the bill, immediate vicinity was inferring quite a close range, i.e., though they gave an example of a pub on the outside and bringing people in. So that was their immediate vicinity. But what outside from that, there's no clarity on that. So one hopes there's going to be clarity on what that looks like. I think the whole area of Zone X, last mile, all that sort of stuff, I don't think you'll get clarity that extent within this Act or this guidance. I think you'll get clarity on immediate vicinity, but not to the extent of we're talking from an event management side.
Yeah. Well, we're running over, but I mean, people can dial off if they have to. But some really good questions coming up. A few more have come in. The responsible person topic.
Yeah.
I saw some interesting aspects there about who's going to be responsible for implementing this, and the interesting nuances of, I'm running an event within a venue, who's in control, those aspects there. And another one sort of semi-linked there around, for an internal lockdown, for a number of venues, is that going to be impractical? Are we looking at moving people away relatively from a place of relative danger to relative safety, because actually a lockdown may not be appropriate to some venues? I know a lot of venues wrestle with some of the existing guidance on that.
I think if you start looking, I don't think you can do a decision based on this will be a lockdown. This could be a lockdown, it could be evacuation, it could be evacuation, because effectively you've got to choose the best solution that saves lives. And it's all going to be dynamic. Going back to the responsible person, it's all about control of the premises, or who's in control of the event itself. Yeah. So if you've got, let's say you've got a parkland, which as you're a promoter, you're going to put a gig on a park. You take the park and you secure the park, and you're in control of the park. You are now that responsible person.
And actually, that question's just come in from one organiser hosting a free-to-attend music carnival event. It's got a licence boundary. It's got bag search.
Yeah.
I mean, probably a bigger question than the topic today is how we're going to approach mitigation, because that's going to be, I mean, every event's different. I think that goes back to the audience, the type of event.
Yeah,
there's a lot of factors there. But, I mean, effectively, you're free to attend, but it's a licensed searched venue.
I'm just going to say, you've got an access control, and you're going to have sort of an access control with a ticket, be it free ticket or otherwise. So that will fall within scope of, say, 800 people. So you become part of that. I need the procedures, I need the measures. What measures? You've got to look at your risk, you look at your target attractiveness, your vulnerability.
Yeah, and I think a final point that's been raised by someone here is there's no master list of all events and venues. So will the SIA be reliant on people self-identifying and submitting in good faith? I mean, I guess to an extent, yes. But they're also going to be looking out there as well, aren't they?
There'll be a legal requirement for responsible person to notify when they become responsible people for an event or premises and cease to be, and equally in relation to events as well. So that'll be a legal mandated process to notify the SIA.
Okay.
One could argue the logistics behind that, to furnish that for the SIA. That's a significant ask.
Well, I think we're going to be kicked out of the studio in a minute. So great questions and engagement on this topic, and a lot more to come. I'm going to ask Garry to have the last word, but from my perspective as an event professional, a resilience planner, as a parent, I'm so reassured to now see that the legislation's finally come in. I mean, a massive thank you to Fegan Murray, Nick Aldworth, all of the team who've worked on the Protect duty. The legacy, I hope, from tragedy from before is that if we make more events and venues safe, we're reducing that impact, reducing that likelihood of it happening. So I'll ask Garry to have the last word, and thanks very much for attending today.
Yeah, thanks for allowing me, Rob. To be honest, think about consequences, think about your risk appetite, your risk tolerance, your target attractiveness. make sure your mitigation is proportionate. Don't go straight to top end. Make sure it's proportionate to that risk, and think about consequences and that. Don't reinvent the wheel.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and more importantly, it's a risk, but there's other risks out there as well. So don't forget the other risks, but join the mitigation together.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks so much for attending today. Recording, resources, links to what's coming next will be in your inboxes, and stay safe. Thanks very much.